So, yeah. Okay, thank you to everyone for being here. My name is Filippo, and I want to talk with you about the use of meta-analysis in consciousness research. Before going into the details, I want to start with some questions. Of course, I'm not expecting the answer right now, but maybe think about it and we will discuss later. So these questions are, which is the average effect size in consciousness research for you? Do you know it? Maybe it's not really a good question, maybe it's too broad. So I'm asking also, which is the average effect size in your specific research area, maybe? Also, if you think about your effect, what are you studying and so on, and if you think about your methodological choices, are you able to predict if you change your methods, are you able to predict the change in the observed effect, for example, in terms of effect size? And also, it's like our research design are powerful enough to detect a reasonable effect size from the sample size, methodological point of view. These are, I think, very interesting question, and some area of psychology are actually asking this question a lot. For example, in social psychology, they try to estimate the average effect size, and it's almost 0.2 in terms of correlation. That is a 0.3, 0.4 in terms of coincidence. And maybe it's not like a very useful information, but I think that it's important to think about effect size, think about research design, think about not only significance and non-significance in our daily research. And I think that maybe the reason why it's difficult to answer to these questions is probably because we are not used to think in this way about our research. Maybe not always, but often, especially in the past. If we think about an average experiment in consciousness research, I'm thinking about a state of consciousness, of course, not like sleep studies or something like this. Usually we have some kind of stimulus, the manipulation of the conscious experience using some psychophysical based techniques. Then we have the assessment of the conscious experience, and then we'll have some kind of data, behavioral data or neural data. And in this kind of prototype, we have a lot of a possibility to change our design. We can use different kind of stimuli. We can use different kind of psychophysical techniques for manipulating the experience. We can use subjective or objective way to assess the consciousness and so on. And this creates a quite scenario in which we have a lot of heterogeneity. And this can be very interesting, but sometimes can be also a problem. For example, there have been some attempts to estimate these in this nice review by Brett Mayer. He identified almost a lot of paradigms for manipulating the conscious experience from a psychophysical point of view. And actually, the difference between one paradigm and another is not only related to having a more efficient paradigm, a more easy to set up paradigm, but also the information that are available to the subject is different. And this is not often taken into account when we plan studies, I think. And also, for example, the way that we measure the consciousness, so using the so-called objective and subjective methods like signal detection theory or awareness scale in general, actually also these have a huge impact of our research. And some of these questions, I think, that we saw at the beginning can actually be not really completely solved, but partially solved with a meta-analytical approach. So before making some example, let's see what is a meta-analysis in a nutshell. So essentially, when we are doing a meta-analysis, we are switching the level of analysis from the participant or the trials in our experiment to the overall study. So we are switching one level up in a sort of multi-level structure of research data. And from a statistical point of view, essentially we are pulling together information, taking also into account the precision, so the amount and the reliability of each study. So we are pulling studies, but also weighting studies. So you can see an average, a weighted average of research results. And also if we have a lot of variability between our studies, so between our effects, we can also try to explain this variability using some study level moderators, and this is quite interesting. And essentially, when we pull together studies with a meta-analytical approach, what we will have is the estimation of the average effect of our research area or the pool of studies that we are considering. And this is quite useful and interesting because we can do some statistical tests on this average, and so try to understand overall if the effect is present and which is the size of the effect, how much uncertainty we have in this estimation, and so on. And also the heterogeneity that is somehow a problem, but also is, for me, is the essence of a meta-analysis, because it's the variability that we try to explain as in primary studies. So we can try to put some study level predictors that are called moderators in meta-analysis, and try to understand why the effect is higher in one condition and lower in another condition. And also we have another interesting property of meta-analysis, that is to pull together all sources of uncertainty. And we can find what is called the prediction interval. And this is another very interesting metric that we can have from a meta-analysis, and essentially is telling us the range of effect that we have to expect if we want to do a new study tomorrow on a specific research topic. And this is quite useful and not always considered. And of course, it's not so easy, but this is the idea. In meta-analysis, we have unlimited modeling options. We can create hierarchical models for handling more complex data structures. Of course, we can use Bayesian models. We can also try to estimate and not really solve, but take into account the publication bias problem that is very common in psychology. And yeah, so it's a very for me, interesting tool. And before going in few example, real example in consciousness research, I want to think also about not only the statistical part, but also what meta-analysis can give us in terms of critical thinking, and what can change, which is the contribution in our way in which we do science. If we think about sampling theory is the most important part of the standard statistical test, okay? And we think about, for example, this is a very simple simulation in which we have the effect size, the real effect size that is 0, okay? But actually, if we don't have studies with a lot of people, with a lot of participants, actually we have a fluctuation around the true value. And what we found in literature, okay, is a sample. So we are sampling from this real distribution. And even if the effect is 0, or even if the effect is present, not always we are going to find reliable and the presence of the effect. And this is quite simple, it's a simple idea, but when we have a meta-analytic overview, this is very clear. Even if there are 2 or 3 studies in literature in a specific topic that is suggesting us that there is an effect, it's not really true that the effect is present, because we will probably have to expect also null results or opposite results, especially if our studies are not very precise, so not with a lot of people, okay? And of course, also, if you think about heterogeneity, so if you think about methodological variables that actually influence the effect, so we have in one condition that the effect is present, but if we change our methods, the effect disappears. So if this change is genuine, is true, we have a more complicated, because actually we have a distribution of real effect, and we necessarily have to try to explain this variability, because otherwise the average that we estimate is not really important. So if we have heterogeneity, it's important to understand which moderators, which predictors are actually explaining this heterogeneity. And finally, often, not always, often, what we found in published literature is not a good sample of our hypothetical sampling method. Because if you think about publishing a result, and if you think about the relationship between probability of publishing and the effect size, this is a quite unbiased overview. So if I want to publish a paper and I found a null result, okay, I should have the same probability of publishing this result, the same as if the effect is very high or is very low, okay? But actually, the situation is much more like this. So it's more likely to publish a result that is with a high effect size and positive instead of a null result. And this clearly creates a bias in the sampling procedure that is called publication bias in meta-analysis. So overall, we have a lot of information that we can grab from a meta-analysis. We can have the average effect size in a specific research area that is quite important, I think. We can have the prediction interval. We can have the publication bias assessment. We can identify important variables that explain heterogeneity, but also we can identify parts of the research of a specific research topic that are problematic, missing, critical, and so on. But is meta-analysis common in consciousness research? For example, I've looking very quickly to neuroscience of consciousness and cognition journals. I found that out of 2,900 publications, only 33 report the word review in the abstract or the title, and only 6 use the word meta-analysis. And to be honest, much of them are not really related to common effects in consciousness research, like subliminal priming or other type of very important effects. And personally, in the topics that I'm trying to do research, I've never found a meta-analysis that try to estimate the parameters that I said before. So let's see some examples. For example, this is a very interesting and a very important meta-analysis published in a high-impact journal about these effects. So the processing of the unconscious processing of threats in general from the visual point of view. And this is quite interesting because they actually pull together information for almost 3,000 participants. So it's a crazy amount of information that we have, and no primary study can have this kind of sample size. So it's a very unique way to pull together information. And they actually try to compare also the consciousness manipulation, so the paradigm to manipulate the consciousness, which is the impact, and also the impact of the primary stimulus, so the stimulus that is used in the studies. And what they found, and that the effect is consistent, but only with fearful faces. Only if we use fearful faces, we have this kind of unconscious processing with the effect size that is considered medium. And also they found that if we use continuous flash suppression or backward masking, is not the same. There is a difference, and this is quite important. So if I have to do a study in this topic tomorrow, I will probably read this meta-analysis first, and I will consider this information. This is why I think that is very important. And also another quite interesting, quite intriguing topic that is the subliminal priming. Another meta-analysis in subliminal priming. This is a little bit old, maybe worth doing an update of this. But for example, again, they pull together 46 papers. That is a huge number, usually for meta-analysis in experimental psychology, try to understand if there is evidence for subliminal masked priming and which factors, of course, influence the effect. They found there is evidence, but also they report that, there are several moderators, so what's a quite complicated meta-analysis, but they identified the variables that actually influence and probably make the effect disappear or make the effect stronger in other conditions. And of course, if I have to do a study in masked priming, I will probably read this meta-analysis, and it's quite useful. But I want to present you also, for concluding, my example, and I think that I can go a little bit into details, but not so much, of course, because it was an overview. So in my case, I was interested in studying the relationship between consciousness and working memory. So especially the possibility that working memory can store, and we can do a working memory task even if we are not aware of the stimulus, okay, from a visual point of view. Actually, traditional working memory models don't really consider the possibility that unconscious information can be within the working memory system from a cognitive point of view. But the first attempt from an experimental point of view to study this phenomenon was by Soto in 2011. And actually they presented standard change detection task, so a working memory task with Gabor patches, and within also a backward masking task. So basically they present a Gabor, they for a very brief period of time, and the Gabor was masked. And even if the participants were not aware of the Gabor in some trials, so after selecting only unseen trials, okay, the performance in the working memory task was still above chance in all conditions. This is quite impressive from my point of view. And the effect is interesting, but also there were some methodological problems, especially in terms of low sample size, low number of trials, and yeah, it was not really very solid from a methodological point of view. After this, there are some other attempts to study this phenomenon, also changing a little bit the paradigm, introducing also some neural measures and so on, and also some attempts to pull together these studies from a narrative point of view, so using systematic review or narrative reviews. I think that narrative reviews are useful, but sometimes if we have a reasonable amount of studies, it's better to do a meta-analysis because we can have all the information that we said before. So basically, for doing a meta-analysis, these are the essential steps. So we have to identify the research problem. We have to do a literature search, of course. We have to grab all the important data in order to compute the effect size. We have to choose our model, and then we have to do all the the analysis and diagnostics and the publication bias assessment and so on. So actually we do the of course the literature research about the topic, try to focus the effect on working memory task, of course, visual stimuli, and actually paper that reported behavioral accuracy. So in order to do the same idea of the Soto paper that we saw before, we found 13 studies, also including unpublished results, so also data from dissertations, PhD dissertation, for example, in order to mitigate the publication bias problem. And what we found, this is the classical forest plot of meta-analysis. We have all the studies with the confidence interval, and then we have the final estimation in the bottom. And what we found is there is evidence of this effect, and the effect is medium. Interestingly, it's quite similar to the first meta-analysis that I showed you, and maybe this is an idea of an effect size in similar paradigm and in fact similar to this. So 0.5, that is considered like a medium effect if we use the Cohen taxonomy, for example. But also there is a huge amount of heterogeneity, and this means that we need to at least explain or try to explain this heterogeneity. At least the average estimation is not really informative. And also analyzing the publication bias, this is the funnel plot, is a plot to visualize the publication bias. Essentially, we have in blue the unpublished results, and on the x-axis you can see the effect size, and on the y-axis is the precision. So this means that low precision studies, so we are here, okay, we should expect like a symmetric scenario, but actually only we have published studies that report the presence of the effect, and systematically unpublished studies that report a very low or null effect. So there is evidence for a little bit of publication bias, as is very often happening when we do a meta-analysis. And if we try to explain the heterogeneity, there is an interesting, I think, result, not really from a statistical point of view interesting, but the idea is that in consciousness, I've realized that a lot of time, for example, a single author or a research group use like kind of a unique methodology to study a phenomenon, and is keep publishing paper with the same methodology that is radically different maybe to another research group. And actually, if we use like research group as moderator, so if we put like research group as a moderator in our meta-analysis, we are actually explaining all the variability. This is not really interesting, not really useful, but I think that it's interesting, the idea that if we have this kind of methodological heterogeneity, it's very difficult to like have a clear overview of a phenomenon. And for example, we try also to use other moderators. In this case, the two most important moderators were the consciousness manipulation paradigm, so the attentional blink, backward masking, continuous flash suppression, and meta-contrast masking. Actually, considering these explain a lot of heterogeneity. And this means that if we have to do a study using this effect, try to investigate in this effect, you will probably have to consider which kind of manipulation you want. In terms of, in some scenario, we have zero effect, for example, with CFS, but in other scenario, we have a greater effect. So I'm not able to explain why, at least now, but I know that the paradigm can have a huge impact. And also the working memory paradigm in this case, so change detection task, delayed detection, delayed estimation task, and delayed match to sample task. This is not really a consciousness related factor, but again, this is another factor that clearly influence the results. If you are interested, we have some link to the preprint and also to the repository for all the code and the data to reproduce the analysis. And I think that there are some problems, let's say, that we cannot solve with a meta-analysis, and it's important to being aware of this. For example, if the topic is too narrow, or we have not a lot of information, as if we have not a lot of people in a primary study, we cannot like have a reliable result. This is the same for meta-analysis. If we have a lot of publication bias, we are essentially estimating something that is completely biased. So it's not really worth doing if we are sure that there is a huge publication bias. Also the heterogeneity, it's good, it's the most interesting stuff of a meta-analysis, but also can be problematic if it's too high. Maybe we have to reduce the topic, we have to do a selection of studies and so on. And of course, we are pulling information from already published studies. So if the published studies have some problems, it's not like really reliable, of course, we are pulling information, and also the pooled estimation will be not reliable. But in general, I think that is a great tool, and I'm really curious to what you think about it. I have some resources if you are interested for conducting and interpreting meta-analysis. I think that these are the top resources in order to do a very good job. And yeah, thank you for your attention.